While Donald Trump rails against the political and media impact of the drip of revelations from the Epstein files, it would be unwise to lose sight of the American president's mercurial impact on geopolitics. Just a month ago, he was using his leverage on Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to push through a ceasefire deal with Hamas. He was angling, unsuccessfully, for the Nobel Peace Prize. But now he appears to have lost interest. Israel has bombed Gaza more than 100 times since that agreement. More than 200 people have been killed. There is no sign of Hamas relinquishing power in Gaza, nor of an international peacekeeping and monitoring force entering the Strip. And then there's Ukraine. The Russian offensive grinds on. Trump's claim to be the indispensable peacemaker looks more and more unconvincing. And, of course, there's Venezuela, where the self-styled peacemaker president seems to be contemplating a military intervention if the autocrat he accuses of being a narco-terrorist, Nicolas Maduro, refuses to quit. Well, to make sense of it all, I'm joined by Gideon Rachman, the Financial Times chief foreign affairs commentator and author of the book Age of the Strongmen. Gideon, if we can, let's start in the Middle East. Would it be fair to say that Trump appears, having pushed through that ceasefire deal, appears to have just sort of lost interest and to some extent walked away?
Yeah, I think so. And I don't think it's hugely surprising. I mean, partly because if you're Netanyahu or Hamas, this is your issue. It's what you're focused on all the time. If you're Trump, a blizzard of stuff is coming at you, whether it's the Epstein stuff or, as you say, overseas, Venezuela, Russia, Ukraine, etc. And he's really stripped down the national security stuff. You know, they don't. Marco Rubio is doing both jobs, Secretary of State and National Security Advisor. They've sacked half the national security stuff, so they don't really have that much kind of bandwidth. And Trump himself, of course, is incredibly mercurial, so his attention is always likely to wander. But I think one other thing is that there's also basically implausibility about a lot of the deal. I mean, getting a ceasefire was one thing, but all of the rest, getting Hamas to disarm, getting a multinational force in, the greatest genius in the world would really struggle to do all of that.
And it would require an enormous amount of political capital invested by Trump personally, and it doesn't really appear that he's interested in doing that. And also I'm interested specifically in his relationship with Benjamin Netanyahu, because it would require real consistent pressure on Netanyahu to get him to stand up to his far-right cabinet colleagues inside Israel. But Trump has just made the rather bizarre pitch to the Israeli president saying that Netanyahu should be given a pardon for alleged corruption crimes. What is his relationship with Netanyahu?
Well, that's a very specific to Trump thing. He doesn't believe that presidents or prime ministers should ever go on trial for anything. And if you look, for obvious reasons, and if you look at, say, his relationship with Brazil, it was very much conditioned by his feeling that it was outrageous that Bolsonaro should be put on trial. So, I think there's Trump's kind of personal interests and idiosyncrasies can never be screened out, because I think often they're the leading edge there. But sure, he's got a very ambiguous relationship with Netanyahu. I mean, there are times when they seem totally hand in glove. At the crunch, just as they went up to the ceasefire, he very visibly, rather theatrically, put pressure on him and forced him to ring the Qataris from the Oval Office and apologized on the phone for bombing Doha. And I do think that really did annoy the Americans, because they have business dealings and other dealings with the Qataris. But then, ultimately, he's always going to be much more sympathetic to Israel than to the Palestinians.
And if there are any constants in Trump, and in a sense this whole conversation is trying to read Trump and make sense of how he's handling geopolitical challenges, one constant seems to be that while he will at times appear, again, performatively to be cross with Vladimir Putin, he doesn't appear to be prepared to put real pressure on the Russian president to end the war in Ukraine.
Well, I think, again, he's been all over the shop. I guess if you were sitting in Moscow, you wouldn't be super delighted about what's about to happen, which is that the tightened oil sanctions are happening on Lukoil, on Rosneft, and so on. And Lukoil...
Do you think they will make a real difference?
No, I think they'll make some difference. I mean, Lukoil are having to do a fire sale of their assets right now. And I think that insofar as there is a Western strategy, it's to try for Ukraine to hold the line and to hammer the Russian economy, to try to destroy the Russian economy, and hope that sometime next year Putin comes to the table. But firstly, that's a stretch anyway. I mean, the Russian economy is doing less well, but it's by no means on its knees. But on the other hand, if you combine that with Ukraine's long-range strikes on Russian oil refineries, tightened oil sanctions, you could see the outlines of a strategy there.
But isn't the truth, it's a truth that Trump can't change, that Putin still believes he can and will win on the battlefield?
Yeah, and I think that is in a way the source of Trump's occasional frustration with Putin. As you mentioned, Trump wants the Nobel Peace Prize, and he believed that through his personal relationship with Putin, he could persuade him to a peace deal. But ultimately, Putin isn't interested in peace. Putin wants the war to continue because he thinks he can win.
Let's talk about Trump's Western Hemisphere in his own backyard, so to speak, because his slogan, that the MAGA movement really likes to hear is "No more wars."
Sure.
I.e., we expend all of our resources at home. We make America great. We don't worry too much about entanglements overseas. And yet, as we speak to each other, the biggest U.S. naval deployment in the region since the Cuban Missile Crisis is currently sort of taking place off the coast of Venezuela, with ever more bellicose threats that the so-called narco-terrorist Nicolas Maduro must leave power, and if he doesn't, then the US will do something to ensure that he's gone. Is it possible that Trump will actually engage in a war in Venezuela?
I think it's possible, but from what I hear, it's unlikely. I mean, military people who know more about what you need to deploy than I would say that even with this very big deployment and the USS Gerald R. Ford out there, they don't actually have enough to mount a full-scale invasion. I think the theory is that he's going for regime change, that they're trying to put such crushing pressure on Venezuela that there's some kind of internal coup. There were rumors that they were trying to bribe Maduro's security detail to fly him out of the country and hand him over. So that would be their first option. Of course, if it doesn't work, and if Trump maintains his concentration on this issue, then maybe they will have to go to Plan B and think about invading. But I do think that would be a real problem for his MAGA base. I mean, in some ways, it's compatible because the whole America First foreign policy says, look at the issues that affect Americans in the heartland, and that's, drugs, fentanyl crossing the southern border, it's migrants, and Trump's can claim to have successfully stopped that flow. So it's look at our own hemisphere kind of makes sense, but I think another war doesn't really. And
is there something deeper about a Trump vision, a national security strategy, which says, in a way, we will focus, as you've just put it, mostly on the homeland and our own backyard of the Western Hemisphere. And frankly, we'll let the other great powers in the world, and I'm thinking of Beijing and I'm thinking of Moscow, we'll let them run their own spheres of influence. And if that means they have to go to war in Taiwan or in Ukraine, we're, in the end, not going to do much to stop them. I mean, is that the way in which the Trump thinking is taking the United States of America?
I was just in Beijing, actually, a few weeks ago, and people I spoke to were very much hoping that that was the case. There was almost a delight at the idea that Trump was going to concentrate America on the Western Hemisphere, and that would tie them up for decades, and indeed China would get a free hand. However, I think that there would be many people in Washington who would push back against that, because it doesn't really makes sense from an American strategic perspective. There's some argument within MAGA circles about whether Europe is still of strategic interest to the US, and maybe the Europeans should take on the burden of pushing back against Russia. But ceding East Asia, which is now the core of the global economy, to China just doesn't really make sense to me.
And just a final thought, which is a more parochial thought, bringing it close to home. The UK foreign policy is at odds with the Trump foreign policy in many different ways. We've recognized a Palestinian state. We want military backing for Ukraine, which Trump isn't prepared to give. Even in Venezuela, we've seen a conflict because it now seems British intelligence is not sharing its regional assets in the Caribbean with US counterparts. And that flies in the face of the so-called Five Eyes commitment to share all intelligence. So to what extent, despite Keir Starmer's best efforts, are we heading towards a place where there is real conflict between the UK and the US on this range of issues?
I don't think we'll get there. I think that if you speak to the British establishment, the special relationship, at least from our point of view, is so deeply embedded that they will They'll try to defend British interests. They may not share intelligence. They won't get involved in things they don't like. But Britain's nuclear weapons, Britain's intelligence assets, a lot of its trade is so bound up with the United States that they're not going to confront Trump unless he does something absolutely outrageous.
Gideon Rachman, we have to end there. It's been great having you on the Times at 1. Thanks very much for joining us.